Before COVID, I have travelled in lots of places around the world to give presentations, and I must say I've never had such a warm welcome as what I've had here. It's been really amazing. I've got to try cheese curds, which I understand are the healthy local delicacy. I heard about all about the old-fashioned. I did see some paper mills. I saw some cows from a distance, actually. I learned about this small, what I would call American football team called the Packers. I think you've all heard of them, but it was new to me. And also, as well, I've learned a little bit about the culture clash between British English and American English. American football being one of them, because that's what I call your kind of football, because we have a different kind of football that you call soccer, which was all very confusing to me. And I also had a little issue about the ground floor and the first floor and where the lift was to the first floor, and I also called it an elevator. So anyway, it was a good reminder that although we speak the same language, there are, small differences sometimes. So I hope you'll forgive me if in my presentation I accidentally use the English word, well, my English word for something. So my presentation today, I've got two presentations. I've got lots of trends to talk you through, but I also want to keep the session really interactive because, as Phil said, it's not just about me talking about the trends, it's about you thinking about them. So in the spirit of interactivity, I'm actually going to start with a little interactive exercise. And I would like you to all imagine that you have been marooned on a desert island, which maybe is, perhaps a nice thing to think about these days. And I'd like you to talk to the person next to you, introduce yourself if you don't know them, but I'm sure most of you do. And I would like you to think of 3 things you're going to take to the desert island. So you need an essential, a luxury, and then something for the group that you are stranded with. So you're in a desert island. What 3 things are you going to take with you? What essential, what luxury, and what item for the group? I'm just going to give you 2 minutes to discuss. So you don't have long to think. So who would like to share what they or their partner that they were talking to is going to bring to the desert island? Do I have any volunteers, or am I going to have to choose a victim? Yes, please.
Well, we were discussing this, and in the theme of the meeting today was our essential would be a water filtration system, right? And then the luxury would be a unlimited Grubhub delivery. And then we picked up that idea that Phil had this morning on the 3D printer for our housing.
Oh, I see. I like that a lot. Very practical, I think, that group, right? Thank you for sharing. And what I do have for you are these very tacky London bus pencils. I was going to make the joke that you can use them to write your insights down with, but they're actually blunt, so you can't do that at the moment. But there you go. Thank you. So does anybody else have any desert island items now they know what wonderful prizes are on offer? Yes, please.
Elon Musk has that Starlink. We thought it would be nice to bring one of those machines with us so that we could keep communicating with people around the world.
Yes, wow, you guys went all out with the technology. I wonder if he'd let you as well. I can imagine he keeps a close watch on those. Anything else you're going to take to your desert island? Just that? Something to start a fire. Very practical. I like the practicality. I should have guessed that you would all be very practical. There you go. Cool, okay. Well, I just wanted to start that off as a little icebreaker. We're not actually going to a desert island, I'm afraid to say. Of course, I'm here to talk about trends. I work for a company called Trend Watching. I'm based in London, as we all know by now, but we have offices throughout Europe and throughout Asia. And what we do is we track trends and we help organizations make sense of change, because one thing is sure, the world is always changing. Social change, economic change, technological change. Hey, here's a British national treasure, right? David Bowie. Change is the only constant. But what we've also seen as well is that the pandemic accelerated change for many things that were already happening, working from home, shopping online. We saw this big acceleration in lots of areas during the last couple of years. Now, it is easy to feel overwhelmed, okay? What should you be doing with all this change? Where should you be taking it? And I'm here to say, don't panic. Okay, don't panic, because despite all of that change, we are still the same humans with the same human needs, okay? Those human needs, like things like authenticity, like connection, they are still intrinsic to who we are. And perhaps the last year or the last 2 years has actually reminded us how important some of them are, you know, how important connection is when we were asked to stay at home for extended periods of time. So perhaps you are familiar with something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At Trend Watching, we sort of tend to think at the top of the pyramid of needs, the sort of self-actualization area. But really, this still sort of underpins a lot of our thinking at Trend Watching. Of course, when it comes to basic needs, we've added a few recently. I also hear that, you know, if there is another pandemic, you guys are going to be fine for the basic human need that is toilet paper. So yes, we have these basic human needs. So here's how we think about things at Trend Watching. When change, like a pandemic, or maybe it's a social change or technological change, bumps up against those core human needs, it creates points of tension. What we do is we look for innovations that are resolving that tension and creating new consumer expectations. So I'm going to talk today a lot about consumer expectations. So really, those are the three elements to understanding consumer trends, okay? So we have basic needs like connection, authenticity. We have drivers of change, technological change, social change, and then we have innovations, new products, new services, new campaigns that are coming into the marketplace that people are experiencing, buying, using. If you create innovations that are just a response to basic needs, you get more of the same. If you create an innovation that is a response to drivers of change, you get novelties or fads, short-term things, which aren't, you know, necessarily bad, but obviously we want to encourage more sustainable innovation, you know, innovation that is here for the long term. And so that's what we say is when you can see how basic needs and drivers of change are bumping up against each other, if you can see the new expectations that consumers have, the expectations that brands are setting, that are already in the marketplace, and then how you can innovate to both meet those expectations and go beyond it. And that is when you can hit the sweet spot. So hopefully today I can inspire you to find some innovation sweet spots. One other thing to say about innovation and sort of our methodology is this idea that you compete in an expectation economy. So you are always competing against the best in class, whoever that is. You know, people bring their experience with Spotify, you know, their highly personalized music experience. They bring that to every brand they interact with. They don't care that you haven't got a tech team the same size as Spotify. They just think, hey, when I use Spotify, I know that they know what I like and they serve me more of what I like, and then they help me find cool new artists that I haven't heard of before but I do like. Why can't you help me do that? They don't think in industry silos, you know, they bring their expectations with them to every brand they interact with. And also consumer expectations, you know, not only do they cross industry lines, but they also cross, you know, country boundaries as well. Thanks to apps like TikTok or Snapchat or Instagram, people can now see what people in other countries are using and the experiences that they are having. So they don't even need to have personally experienced, for example, Spotify, to have it change their expectations. So that's why in my presentation I've got innovations from lots and lots of different industries. And maybe you might think, well, I don't work in FMCG, I'm not a fashion brand, that doesn't have any interest for me. What does it actually mean? You know, what will consumers expect from you after they have experienced that? That's the question to keep asking yourself. If you're interested in trend methodology, we did write a whole book about this, so please, you know, feel free to keep learning about trends, or do ask me some questions later. I'm nearly finished with our methodology piece. Just a couple more things to say. Is that, you know, at the start of the pandemic, you know, there was a lot of talk about the Great Reset. And I think we can agree that maybe that hasn't really happened. But there has been a lot of interesting shifts in sort of consumer perception and consumer expectations. So here's a stat from very early on in the pandemic from 2020, when 86% of adults from 27 countries agreed that I want the world to change significantly and become more sustainable and more equitable. Perhaps we were all looking for a silver lining in those early days, but what we've definitely seen is that it really has sort of driven a change in how people think about brands. So this is research from a company called Edelman. They think a lot about brand relevance. They've been tracking this sort of thing for a really, really long time, and they've always seen brand relevance as being linked to culture building, with purpose more linked to companies and society more linked to government. But now they're seeing brands really sitting at the intersection of those 3 points. You know, brands need to think about how they build culture. They need to think about the purpose they have, and they need to think about how they are giving back to society. So they sit at the intersection of those 3 points. And that's a really interesting shift in how consumers think about brands, but also how brands need to think about themselves. And one other point I just wanted to pull out from that Edelman study is that people today are more focused on the we than the me. So they are more interested in brands that focus on making the world a better place rather than on making them a better person. And one more point, just to sort of underline all of this. This is from the IBM Institute for Business Value, which is a bit of a mouthful to say. Purpose-driven consumers who really want to consume products and services that align with their values now represent the largest segment of consumers at 44%. So we've seen this big shift to purpose over the last couple of years. I'm not going to continually talk about purpose throughout this presentation, but I kind of want you to just keep this framework in mind as we go through. Okay, so we're going to move on to the trends. We've got lots and lots of trends, slides to go through, lots of content. Hopefully we don't feel too much like Elmo by the end of the session. But we've got 2 trends, 2 mega trends with some sub-trends underneath them. So the mega trend is kind of the big trend, and then the sub-trends are sort of opportunities underneath it. So I've got 2 for this session and 2 for my next session. And the other thing to say as well is, you know, as sort of Phil hinted at, and as I sort of already said, unless you think about what to do with trends, they're just nice to know. So I've got light bulb moments, some questions for you to think about. Hopefully we'll have time for a little bit of discussion on your tables, more prizes for sharing, of course. And one final thing to say about trends and innovating is, you know, at Trend Watching, we do have something called the Consumer Trend Canvas, which talks people through analysing a trend and then applying it for their business, whatever that business is. This is actually available freely online, so if you're interested or want to think about ideation, there's lots of tools to think about, and it really sort of can complement sort of foresight work. So let's actually get onto the trends. I've teased you enough. So my first trend, I'm going to start by touching on sustainability, which is of course, a very, very, very big and very important topic. And I'm actually going to start with a question. Does anybody remember this campaign from Patagonia? It was actually about 10 years ago. So they were quite ahead of the curve, and when it was Black Friday, they actually ran a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, "Don't buy this jacket." So they actively encouraged people not to buy their product on Black Friday, which is, of course, a very big shopping event. Patagonia have always been quite ahead of the curve when it comes to sustainability and consumer sentiment. And what we've really seen in the past 5 years or so, and I think we're going to keep on seeing, is that consumers are increasingly aware of the negative environmental and social impacts of their consumption, and they're embracing more mindful modes of consumption. They're starting to think more about what they consume. They also think that brands need to do more to help them consume responsibly. And we're starting to see, early signs of that. The US government, President Biden, signed an executive order last year, which is basically going to force or sort of lead to regulations that force companies to allow right to repair when it comes to electronics items, basically extending the lifespan of consumer tech. It's also something that the European Union are legislating as well. Brands are trying to get ahead of this. So Apple announced last year that you're going to be able to soon repair your own iPhone or your own Mac. If you're like me and you drop your phone regularly, this is actually a really good idea. They're rolling it out, of course, to new models. But just an interesting way to think about how a brand that creates a product is actually also now starting to shift into a different kind of service that's related to that product. And all sorts of brands are thinking about how they can extend the lifespan of products or what you do with a product at the end of its life. IKEA, this actually also coincided with Black Friday. Clearly it's a time to make a statement about consumption. Have a buy back and resell furniture scheme. So when you're finished with your IKEA furniture, you can actually sell it back to the brand, as long as you haven't modified it or damaged it too much, of course. And then they then either rehome it, resell it, really depends. So they've just rolled that out to 33 stores across the US. So what ties all these together, of course, is circularity. And we're seeing new kinds of circular solutions. You know, the circular economy as an idea has existed for quite a while, but there's lots and lots of interest at the moment in, you know, how can we drive new circular solutions, and technology is really kind of helping to drive that. So if we take the fashion industry, for example, the fashion industry generates apparently 92 million metric tons of waste every year, which is an incredible amount. There has been a really, really interesting shift and interest to second-hand fashion. In fact, ThredUp, who are a resale platform for second-hand fashion, say that resale is expected to grow 11 times faster than the broader retail clothing sector by 2025. I think there's a few factors playing into this here. This is very much being driven by younger consumers who perhaps sometimes don't have as much money, you know, and buying resale, buying secondhand is often cheaper. It is also, of course, more sustainable. Gen Z are very interested in, you know, caring for the environment. And also as well, you can sometimes find pieces that are more original. You know, why go to the shop where everybody is buying things from when you can buy something secondhand and hopefully have something that's unique? So we're starting to see some of the taboos around buying secondhand or reusing kind of falling away. And here's just one example of that kind of popping up on the high street. Madewell, the denim brand, actually partnered with ThredUp, the resale partner, to open this boutique that sells second-hand apparel. So it's all second-hand Madewell apparel. But as you can see, it's not kind of your average thrift store. It's very nicely laid out. It's kind of very chic. It's just trying to elevate the buying experience of second-hand a little bit. And you can also get your products repaired there as well. So it's not just resale, but you can also get your denim fixed, altered. So you can also extend the life cycle of the product you already own as well. And just sticking with fashion, I just wanted to show you this very interesting example. It was recently funded on Kickstarter. It's from a company in Canada called Johnny. So it's a sneaker that is fully biodegradable, but the catch is that it also has a seed inside the sole. So when you're finished with your sneakers at the end of their life, you just plant them in the garden and a tree grows. Now, I have to say that this was funded on a crowdfunding site called Kickstarter. It hasn't yet come to market, so I can't verify that this actually works. But what I can say is it definitely raised a lot of money on Kickstarter. People were really interested in and really want to get their hands on products like this, you know, that basically have no impact. You know, at the end of their life, you're not left with a pair of shoes that you feel a little bit guilty about and you're not sure what to do with. You just put them in the garden and it grows into a tree. I mean, it remains to be seen whether that tree grows. I'm also not very good at gardening, so I think my tree would, you know, who knows how long it would last. But anyway, these are the kinds of things that are starting to come to market. And one other thing just to quickly talk about that perhaps you might have seen before is something from TerraCycle called Loop. So this is basically a sort of a sustainability as a service model. So the idea is that you can order products like you usually would from Gillette, from Haagen-Dazs, from big brands, and they come in these metal containers. When you've used the product, you just send it back, TerraCycle, sterilize it, and then reuse it again. So the packaging is constantly being reused. It's kind of a much more circular system. They have expanded across a lot of the US. They're just starting to expand in Europe. They are sort of adapting to local markets, depending on kind of the consumer sentiment there. But these kinds of things are, starting to come and starting to change consumer expectations. And I just want to think quickly, look, to make a real impact, circular initiatives often need to go beyond the consumer. There's only so many times that we can use Loop. It only makes a certain kind of impact, to really push the needle on sustainability, industry-wide change is needed. And I just wanted to share one example with you that I found from Germany. So there's a certain section in Germany along the River Rhine, which is, the sort of, when you think about a polluting manufacturer, it is the snapshot. There's factories belching smoke, tick. There's toxic waste, tick. It's nothing good. They actually found that a lot of the manufacturing was being outsourced to other countries. So they had this kind of dead space that they didn't really know what to do with. They've got a lot of existing infrastructure there. It's a bit worn out, but they've got a lot of, space and empty buildings. So what they are actually doing is they've taken a cue from Silicon Valley, and they're actually developing in that space what they call Circular Valley. So what they are doing is they're investing in circular economy startups. They are inviting local universities, local brands to come in and use the business or use the spaces that are already there to work together to develop products or develop solutions that work towards a more circular economy. And I just thought it was a really interesting way to think about how not only something like the circular economy applies to products and services, but can also apply to place as well, because they're really trying to change the perception of this area. So our first light bulb moment. Consumers increasingly expect brands to help them eliminate any direct or indirect negative environmental impact. How will that impact future services, product development, and more? Okay, so I'm going to keep going through the trends, and then I'll give you a couple of minutes to talk about them once we've got to the end. Something else to talk about as well is this idea of not just sustainability, but actually regeneration. Many people feel that sustainability is actually too passive, and they want to feel like there's a more active take on sustainability, and that is often regeneration. So that's what this second trend is all about. It's called eco boosters, and it's about how brands and consumers are working together to build systems that support changing social values and protect the planet. And of course, when you hear the word regenerative, perhaps the first thing you might think of is agriculture, because those two are often tied together, often used together. The shift to regenerative agriculture is obviously very expensive. Farmers need a lot of support to do that. So big brands like Knorr and Nestle are starting to do that in Europe, supporting farmers who are making a switch to more regenerative solutions. And just one I wanted to just show you here from the US, Cargill. They have a big regen program that pays farmers for improving soil health and sequestering carbon. I'm just going to check my notes. So it's part of a 10 million acre regenerative agricultural project that they want to push out over the next year. What is actually also very interesting as well is they're not just paying farmers to make the switch, they're also giving them tools that help them measure how effective their measures are. So the farmers are able to tell, are we actually having an impact here? And of course, I think it's interesting to think about how consumers can get involved in this as well. Now, obviously, we've gone from a big scale agriculture example there to a much more small scale one. But I like this one because the consumer can really get involved. The brand is called Christy Dawn. They're a very small, sustainable fashion label. What they asked their consumers to do was invest $200 to support regenerative cotton farms in India. So far, their consumers have invested in almost 200 plots of land. And the idea is that when the cotton that is on their plot of land is harvested, they basically get some credit that they can spend with the brand, because the brand then uses that cotton to make their products. So it's involving the consumer in the supply chain, but also at the same time improving agriculture as well. Just a couple more examples to share. Perhaps you didn't think I would talk about pet food today. Who knew that there was innovation in the pet food space? It was kind of news to me when I found this example as well. So this is Chippin. They make dog food. Now, one of the issues with pet food is that salmon is often a key ingredient in pet food. My cat particularly loves to eat salmon. He'll follow you around the house if he thinks he's in with a chance of eating some. It's a very popular ingredient, but it's also a threat from overfishing, from habitat loss and ocean warming. But actually some species of fish are doing a little too well. So Asian carp, for example, they are really flourishing in some waters. So what they have done is they've made the switch from salmon to silver carp, with the idea being that, you know, pets can still enjoy, because, you know, it's also a joke in Britain that we love our pets more than we love our children. I don't have children, but, you know, if you want your pet to, you know, have the most sustainable option available to it, you can now buy pet food that is perhaps having a positive impact in the environment, because it is taking out an invasive species rather than further depleting resources that are really sort of facing issues. And one other innovation, just to talk you through here, this is Coty, the beauty brand. They've started working with a startup called LanzaTech to make fragrances using carbon captured ethanol. So LanzaTech have developed a solution that allows them to take CO2 from industry emissions and turn it into ethanol. But obviously they then need to do something with that ethanol, so they're now starting to partner with big brands, Coty being one of them. Ethanol is by volume the biggest ingredient that is used in fragrances by Coty. So now they are starting to use this carbon captured ethanol. They've just rolled out a couple of samples, and it's going to kind of fully roll into production across this year. And LanzaTech are also partnering with the athletic brand Lululemon to create fabric that is made from carbon captured ethanol as well. So my two questions here are, could brands and consumers work together to rehabilitate the planet? How can you switch your thinking from less harm to positive impact? You know, doing less harm is no longer good enough. How can you actually have a positive impact? Okay. Our last trend in this mini theme. So I've talked a lot about sustainability and the growing awareness that consumers have of the impact they have on the planet. But I don't want you to think that this trend is just about going green, okay? That's kind of just the start of it. What we've really seen, as I said at the start, is this shift towards more mindful consumption. People have, over the last couple of years, really started to understand that when they buy something off of the shelf, there's actually a big supply chain behind that, right? We all remember the event that spawned 1,000 internet jokes, 1,000 memes, the boat that got stuck in the Suez Canal. But it had very real implications, you know, there wasn't certain products on the shelves. Or we've also seen over the past couple of years, you know, supply chain issues with microchips. So maybe we weren't able to buy the new tech we wanted at Christmas or something like that. So people have actually started to realize, wait, the things I'm buying, they actually come from somewhere and we are being impacted by it. And of course as well, you know, inflation is driving up prices. Lots of people are rethinking, do I actually really need to buy this? You know, people are starting to question consumption a little bit more. And that also goes hand in hand with questions around capitalism. You know, this is data from Edelman, which is the company we talked about at the start. You know, they have done lots of research that finds that people are increasingly sort of dissatisfied with capitalism and the kind of buy more sort of mindset they create, and they are moving away from it. But of course, as we all know, sometimes we have good intentions to buy less things or run more or eat fewer donuts, and we don't always manage it. You know, we're human. These things, you know, life gets in the way sometimes. So this final trend is called intervention seekers, and it's all about how brands can stop enabling cycles of unsustainable behavior and instead place restrictions on people for the good of themselves, society, and the planet. Now, of course, when it comes to putting restrictions on people, you need to approach it a little bit carefully, okay? Nobody wants to be lectured to as though, you know, the brand is telling them what to do, the board is lecturing them, do eat this, don't eat that. You know, there is obviously a fine line, and I think it needs to feel like the brand and the consumer are in it together. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. This is a retailer called Toward. They're a sustainable focused retailer. They're very popular with Gen Z. They just announced that they are enforcing an annual order limit. So you can only make 12 orders with them a year, so 1 per month, no more. And it is opt-in, okay? They haven't forced this on everyone, but if you are trying to reduce your fast fashion purchases, maybe this is the way forward. I mean, maybe you should also have more willpower, but hey, we'll leave that at the door. Also, as well, this credit card rewards people for climate smart spending. So it's called the Future Card. It's backed by Visa. And essentially, if you buy the lower carbon alternative, so if you choose to take the train instead of flying, if you choose public transport over driving, if you choose, I feel like this is a little bit of a controversial one to say here, oat milk over cow's milk. If you choose what they say is the less carbon intensive option, you get more rewards. So you get 5% rewards for making the green choice, whereas if you make the non-green choice, you only get 1% rewards. So it's sort of nudging people into more sustainable behavior. And that idea of nudging is actually something that the financial services sector are, really exploring. In Australia, there's a very big bank called CommBank, and they realized that there are people that have very high interest on their credit cards, but also often get tax rebates from the government. But somehow they never seem to use this tax rebate, this so-called free money, to pay off their credit card. They just it gets lost somewhere. So they've started rolling out nudges to try and encourage people to use this money to pay off their credit card, showing them how in the long run it will actually benefit them, they will accrue less interest. Now, I was a little skeptical when I heard this, but in the trials, it was actually very, very successful. The consumers were really receptive to being helped with their finances, being helped to manage their money, and in the long run, spending less on their credit card interest fees. And one thing before we finish this trend, and as I sort of already said, look, we know that we often have intentions to live better. 80% of people who make New Year's resolutions will have failed them by the second week of February. That includes me, okay? Often, we think about New Year's resolutions, we tie them to maybe eating healthier or exercising more. And you're in a little bit of a tricky place with that kind of thinking if you essentially make a product that is not very good for people, like chocolate. So Tony's Chocolonely, who are an ethical chocolate brand, they're based in the Netherlands. They're well known for fair trade and for all of these kinds of things. But they have realized that, hey, we preach that we're an ethical brand, but we're actually making a product that is not so good for people. So what they've started doing is they've started putting, labels on their packaging, warning people that their product isn't very good for them, which is actually quite a big step for a chocolate company to take. They're also trying to encourage more healthy eating habits through the inside of the packaging. So you do have to open the chocolate to find those, which personally I find a bit of a flaw because I probably would have started eating it already. And what they're also doing is lobbying for a sugar tax in the Netherlands. The per person consumption of sugar in the Netherlands is actually very high. So here they are, sort of pushing for legislation that would help make consumers healthier, but actually might mean they sell less of their product. So just a really interesting thing to think about. So intervention seekers, the shift to more mindful consumption isn't going to happen overnight. How can brands help consumers make the shift from thinking to doing? And I think that's the crucial question to ask there. Okay, so we've had our megatrend theme, and we've seen 3 sub-trends. I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes just to talk about what you've seen so far with the person next to you, any innovations you want to discuss, any that you are like, wow, what is Vicki talking about today? I am going to leave you with just 2 minutes to discuss them, and then we'll come back for our second trend. So over to you for a little bit. Anybody like to share what they were discussing about that first set of trends? Do I have a volunteer? Yes. Steve is just coming to you with thank you, Steve.
Surely the environmental issue across all sectors, how does that impact who we are serving and who we're helping?
Yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts about our first trend? Oh, yes, Judy.
We were talking about DAC, which is direct air capture, where there are now facilities that pull carbon right out of the air. So when you talk about using that carbon in fragrances, fabrics, interesting concept.
Mm-hmm.
And with the latest infrastructure bill, there was $3.5 billion set aside to build 4 DAC facilities in the United States. There's one that exists now in Canada, and they're building one in Texas,
Mm-hmm.
partially because they want to keep, using oil. So if they can reduce the carbon, then you can justify using the oil if you can get a net zero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting.
The challenge is there's going to be a whole lot of carbon, so what do you do with that?
Yes. Yeah. And it's very interesting sometimes how, I talked about this, I think it might have been with you, Judy, how some, green technologies actually do then create their own problems, like electric vehicles, for example. What do you do with those batteries? Or in London at the moment, those electric scooters are really popular. You can't go anywhere without being almost knocked over by someone on an electric scooter going really fast on the sidewalk, not pavement. And yeah, what do you do with the batteries there? So they're an amazing micro-mobility solution, but they do have other challenges down the line. Cool, okay, well thank you for sharing. Thank you, Steve. I will ask to hear some more of your thoughts in a bit. I'm going to move on to our second theme, which is glass box brands. And I'd like to start this by talking about something we haven't really discussed yet, a big driver in the world, which is, of course, connectivity. So as you can see from this graph, between 2016 and 2026, smartphone adoption will have almost doubled. Smartphones have obviously revolutionized, almost everything, okay? From giving people directions to how we message people to taking photos of everything and so on. But they also made us constantly connected. And the thing I want to talk about here is how that constantly connected world has ushered in a world of radical transparency, one where an organization's internal culture and processes are an increasingly important part of their external facing brand, okay? So we've seen over the past sort of few years, lots of brand scandals related to how brands treat their staff or their employees, or even, the things that happen when you are interacting with a brand. Perhaps you remember Starbucks being forced to apologize after 2 black men were arrested for so-called loitering in a Starbucks store, and the way that the staff that worked for Starbucks reacted to that. That sort of really made the headlines across the world, I think. The shift, the sort of inside-out shift, is also being felt in the workplace too. Digital communication tools, which really boomed during the pandemic with lots of people working from home, messaging platforms like Slack, for example, allowed people to start to band together around things like gender discrimination or pay discrimination. These scandals are now starting to make waves beyond internal walls. Maybe if there was a company scandal, it would have stopped at the office wall. Now the ripple effect continues. At Apple, for example, there was a big revolt of Apple employees after Apple decided to hire someone who wrote quite a controversial book about Silicon Valley, which many people say is misogynistic. His name, and I'm just going to check it to make sure I get it right, Antonio Garcia Martinez. Lots of staff opposed his hiring, and they actually forced the Apple higher powers to essentially terminate his contract before he even started. And Apple is obviously a company that is traditionally very closed. From what I understand, I haven't been, but at the Apple headquarters, they run it almost like the CIA or the FBI, where you have to have special passes to get into special parts of the building. That is a very closed internal culture. Now their staff are starting to band together and protest about what the brand is doing. And of course, look, people, as we've already said, want to buy from brands that have strong values, that prioritize diversity and inclusivity in their communities and in their workplaces too. One little thing to say about trust in brands is that, particularly in the US at the moment, is not in a good place. Funnily enough, the red end of the slides are the danger zone. Where is the US? Oh, just here. Trust in brands declined by 5 percentage points between 2020 and 2021 to 2022. There wasn't actually a bigger decline anywhere else other than Germany. So consumers are increasingly, distrustful of brands, distrustful of their promises. Perhaps you've heard of a term called greenwashing, where, brands dress up their sustainability initiatives. And look, delivering corporate transparency, allowing people to see, behind the curtain, as it were, total transparency might be almost impossible, but brands that do open up their internal culture and that show progress, admit to failings, share what they are doing, will fare better than those that try to have a very closed doors approach. Many consumers are going to be more willing to admit someone that tries and fails than someone that you're not even sure what they're up to. One example of that, this is Ace and Tate. So they are an eyewear brand. They're trying to transition to a B Corp. And in the route to becoming a B Corp, they realized that they'd actually made quite a lot of mistakes along the way. They mixed bamboo with plastic in an attempt to make more sustainable glasses cases. That was a bad idea. They had some problems in their supply chain and so on. So they just kind of owned up to it and said, look, we want to do better. We haven't done so great in the past. This is where we're at. We're trying to improve. And this is actually a very powerful campaign in terms of, brand communications and a brand being willing to admit when they have done something wrong. And particularly thinking about sustainability as well. Lots of executives, many companies have sustainability policies in place. Executives think that consumers are aware of them, but consumers actually don't have any information to back up a lot of claims around sustainability, and increasingly as well around inclusivity. Just because you've published an inclusivity memo or published something about diversity doesn't mean that you're actually making changes. It is very hard to discover the truth. So that is where this next trend comes in. So it's called Green by Numbers, and it's all about how consumers who are tired of empty virtual signaling and seeking this transparency want brands to make it easier for them to make more informed choices. So it's time to swap marketing for metrics, start measuring impact and making results viable. So let's look at a few innovations. So this one is from Nislo. So they are a footwear brand based in Nashville. They do produce in quite small batches. When you buy your shoes from them, you get like a sustainability facts card, and it tells you the people that made your shoes. It talks about the supply chain, it talks about the planet, the CO2 impact. You can see it there really clearly. They grade themselves, you have percentages, and there's also a QR code on the box if you do want to find out more. Sticking with this idea of insights, this is another interesting innovation from Klarna. So Klarna are a buy now, pay later platform. A little bit controversial because they basically allow people to get themselves into debt. They've recently come into lots of hot water in the UK. They're trying to regulate the the industry. So we'll just sort of ignore that aspect of it for a moment. And I just want to talk about how they are rolling out carbon footprint insights to 90 million shoppers. So I just have a little video just explains how it works. Okay, so yeah, allowing you to basically see the carbon impact of your products. And what's interesting is that obviously they are sort of sitting on top of the brand as well. You know, it's not even that they have gone and done their own research and worked things out. They're working with, you know, third-party providers who are giving them this information. So even if as a brand you are not disclosing some of this information, there are now ways for consumers to find it out through things like this or through other third-party services. And what I think is quite interesting about this as well is that they also put it into context as well, because what do 100 grams of CO2 emitted really mean? Like what does that mean? So I think it's also about educating people as well. And this is a little bit more of an extreme example. So this is a grocery store in Sweden. So they have long been involved with sustainability, but they realized that maybe their messages weren't getting through. So what they actually decided to do was create a concept grocery store where items were not priced in, you know, dollars, pounds, euros, krona, but they were instead based on their climate impact. And then you got a certain amount of climate credits you could use each week. So when you did your shopping, you know, you only had, you know, 100 climate credits that you could use. Your tomatoes maybe cost less than your meat did. So it was forcing people not just to think about how they shop based on price, but also how they shop based on climate impact. Now, obviously, this was just a pop-up. They're not, you know, this isn't how you shop when you go to Sweden. But they just wanted people to start thinking about it. And also when I was reading more into it, they were saying that maybe in the future, you know, if we do get to a point where, you know, the climate change is actually very urgent and we haven't made changes, maybe this is how we will need to shop. You will need to think more about your climate budget before you think about your actual monetary budget. And look, there are all sorts of ways of, you know, helping people shop more sustainably online. This is a little browser plugin that you can use when you are shopping with Chrome. When you're shopping on Amazon, it helps you rank products. What does it get out of 10 for making it, buying it, using it, end of life, and so on. So like I say, even if as a brand you're not providing some of these insights, you know, consumers have a way of finding them out. And, you know, look, we're still seeing brands, you know, get into hot water for sort of greenwashing. Just last week, Innocent Drinks, who are of course owned by Coca-Cola, actually had an advert in the UK banned because they claimed their drinks helped the environment, and the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority, basically said that, well, actually, there's no proof that your drinks do improve the environment, so to your advert. And they've also... Innocent have always had this kind of wacky advertising, which is, I can't believe I just used the word wacky, but anyway. They've always had this kind of like, yeah, branding that's quite irreverent. Now, the Advertising Standards Agency in the UK at least is sort of pushing back at that. So, green by numbers, measuring improvements turns pledges into tangible progress. Really at this core, this trend is about accountability and staying the course long after the headlines around sustainability or social justice or whatever it is that you want to change have gone. So how can you prove that you are going beyond a one-off campaign? And I think measuring and metrics is one way to think about that. Okay, moving on to our next trend in this section. This trend is called open source solutions. We've talked a lot about, you know, brands, you know, working to change the world, to be more sustainable, to be more purposeful. Lots of brands have those kinds of initiatives in place. But sometimes to solve some of our biggest problems, it's not enough to do it alone. Sometimes you have to work with other people. And so that's what this trend is all about. It's called open source solutions. And it's all about opening up and sharing your processes, showing what you're doing internally. If you're making progress on something, why not share it with other people and let them make progress too? So a few innovations just to quickly talk you through. Electronic Arts, who are a game developer, they've been developing accessibility patents for people or for gamers with any form of disabilities. They've actually made those patents available to other game developers now. So if you want to make more accessible games, you can tap into some of Electronic Arts, I don't know why I find that so hard to say, what they have already been doing. Ford and HP are actually working together to turn 3D waste into auto parts. So they're taking 3D printed offshoots or offcuts, essentially, and then turning them into little elements that they can use in automobiles. So that's an example of brands not necessarily sharing things, but working together in a really collaborative way. Also thinking about sharing, it can also have an impact beyond sustainability, as I sort of keep trying to touch on. Lots of people in the US do not have enough data in their credit files to generate a FICO score. Many people score below 680. So a lot of big banks have got together to share each other's customer deposit records for credit card approvals. So JP Morgan Chase, US Bank, Wells Fargo, US Bank Corp are basically going to start pooling the data that they have on people to make it easier for people to improve their credit. And look, what happens when two trends bump up against each other? That is a very good question. So what happens when green by numbers meets open source solutions? So perhaps you might end up with something like this. Unilever, L'Oreal, Henkel, some big cosmetic brands are currently working together to come up with an industry-wide impact scoring system. So they're working with a third-party provider to basically figure out the carbon footprint of all of the products in their ranges, meaning that when you go to the shop, you'll be able to compare a product from Dove to a product from Vaseline to a product from Lifebuoy, because they've developed it together, they've developed it in a shared way, and it's going to be consistent across all of those products. And one other brand just to mention here, so Allbirds are a sustainable shoe brand. They were very early on with, showing the carbon footprint of their footwear. But they're also continuously pushing the needle when it comes to sustainability. So they've actually made an open source calculator that allows other brands to calculate their carbon footprint. So other brands can't say, oh, but it's too complicated now, I can't calculate my carbon footprint. Ugh. You can actually use their open source tool to do that. And there's a really nice quote from the CEO of Allbirds where they say, competition got us into this mess being, the climate crisis. Perhaps collaboration will get us out of it. Maybe that's a really nice mindset for businesses to have, particularly when it comes to these, big problems that cut across, lots and lots of industries. So open source solutions. Now, I should say that the examples in this trend might be new, but the idea of sharing things is actually not new. Volvo invented the 3-point seatbelt in 1959, and then they shared that innovation with the world. What could you do in 2022 that could still be being shared in 50 years' time, or that could still be having impact in 50 years' time, We've already got the seatbelt, so we don't need any more of those. But a really powerful thought to think about, how could you make a change that could still be being felt, that far into the future? Okay, one more trend to go. I just want to talk a little bit more about glassbox brands within the concept of employees. So 1/4 of US consumers believe that a company's treatment of its employees has increased in importance as a buying criteria since the pandemic started. companies' actions in the pandemic, especially towards their consumers or employees, will be remembered for a long time and can lead to goodwill. So in short, how you've treated your consumers and your people during times of crisis, people are going to judge you on that for quite some time. And so that's what this next trend is all about. It's called insider trading. It's not about any dodgy financial deals. It's about how you can make internal changes, how you can treat your staff better, make positive changes to your internal culture, and then tell the world about it. And, internal change can be very difficult, but in a Glassbox Brands world, it will be expected. So let's look at a few innovations. My first one is from Desigual, who are a Spanish fashion brand. They recently invited their workers to vote on whether they would like a 4-day work week. Now, obviously, 4-day work weeks as a concept has been floating around for some time. The pandemic, I think, really made people take a step back and think about their work-life balance, think about what they are getting from life, and that maybe they don't want to work all the time. And 86% voted in support of a 4-day work week. So they're going to cut their hours from 39.5 hours to 34 hours. Perhaps you're wondering what happens with the wages. Good question. I wondered that too. So the salaries are going to be cut by 13%. The company is absorbing half. Employers essentially face a 6.5% reduction in their pay. But they have obviously decided that, it's kind of worth it to work a bit less. And this idea of working less, as I said, has been discussed quite a lot, but it's often within salaried roles. They're starting to see, experiments with other kind of workers as well. So this is DIG. They are trying to bring the 4-day work week to the restaurant industry. So they're a fast casual restaurant chain here in the US. What they are inviting their staff to do is actually work longer days, but work fewer. So they actually then have a much more efficient and successful work-life balance. When you work in kitchens and the hospitality industry, it is often long days anyway, but often your shift patterns change. So they're really trying to help people know, okay, I have more fixed working patterns. I have more control over the days I do and don't work. So they've been running this as a pilot. They started it during the pandemic, but they are starting to really continue it now. They're pushing it out to more restaurants. And early signs suggest that employees find this really helpful, better work-life balance, improved mental health, able to spend more time with their families, also able to, maybe start education or do other things in their spare time because they have a much more consistency around their working routine. Switching from 4-day work weeks for a moment, this agency launched an internship for people who are, shock horror, 55 and older. Now, obviously, the advertising sector is often very, very dominated by young people, but they realize that people who are older do often have, lots of experience, lots of insights, lots of expertise that they can bring to the team. But often, you wouldn't make a career switch into advertising typically once you have reached this kind of age. So they are trying to, bring new voices, bring new points of view into their processes with this internship that is, aged at people who are 55 plus. And I think, I'm just going to read the quote from the person who runs culture and operations. They say, you could be a retired hotel concierge that's interested in running our front of house, a detective who wants to do some insights work, or a newspaper cartoonist who's looking for the next creative challenge. So they're basically appreciating that, people do have skills that they can bring to their agency and perhaps offer something different than, all the millennial and sort of close to Gen Z employees who maybe all have the same frame of reference. But perhaps the most forward-thinking brands will have impact beyond their own walls. So Unilever are thinking about how they can raise living standards across the entire supply chain of brands, products that they are working with. So they're not just looking at their direct employees, but the employees that are behind the employees that are behind the employees that are behind the employees. They want to create this ripple effect of uplifting. And obviously, if you are a brand like Unilever, you've got a lot of reach. You could eventually be reaching a lot of people. And also as well, thinking about what you do internally, training your staff is also incredibly important, particularly when it comes to things like sustainability. Deloitte, who are a consulting firm, they're based in the UK, but they do have offices all over the world. They're rolling out a learning program to 33,000 staff across the world. So a climate learning program, almost like an MA for climate change. And what they also hope as well is not only are Deloitte is their own staff, learning more about climate change, because they're consultants, they're able to bring that knowledge about climate change and their new understanding to their clients as well. So a bit like with Unilever, there's that continued ripple effect. One more thing to say is, really a new workforce is going to have new demands. As Gen Z enter the marketplace, they are looking at what millennials and, my generation have done wrong, and the generations before them when it comes to work. And they have new demands. They are thinking about 4-day work weeks. That isn't a sign of, not being ambitious. That's a sign of maybe valuing your mental health and valuing yourself as well as your career. They increasingly expect things like financial wellness resources and lots of other things as well. And of course, the Great Resignation the Great Resignation is something that we've all seen in headlines. We know that people are perhaps quitting their jobs. They've had this moment of reckoning, shall we call it, with the pandemic. Hopefully no one is quitting in quite such a dramatic fashion as this. This is actually an old Kit Kat advert. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with it. I remember it from my childhood. So yeah, we're seeing people quit their jobs. We're seeing people looking for this greater work-life balance. So perhaps, treating your staff better is one way, not to overcome the Great Resignation, because I wouldn't suggest that you force people to continue working, but, actually giving people what they want when they work, whether that is, more training, whether that is a better work-life balance, whether that is, opening up new things to them. So insider trading, ask hard questions about your internal culture and innovate for better answers. Is there a particular concern that's relevant to your workers or your future workers? Think about everything from work hours and patterns to vacation allowances and many more things. Okay, so that is almost the end of our second trend. Just a couple of things to say here, and maybe this just helps sort of sum up this trend. Businesses used to be a little bit like a black box. From an outside perspective, it was very hard to see what was going on inside. A brand put their brand on the outside and you could choose whether you wanted to engage with it or not. But now, thanks to this radical transparency, these little devices and social media, that brand is now like a glass box. You can see inside the brand, you can see what the people that work there think about working there. You can, research the CEO. You can start looking at diversity reports. You can see into the brand. You can make judgments about whether that brand is something you want to align yourself with. So the final thought to sort of leave you with is that your internal culture could become the most powerful brand and marketing asset you have. And really at this point, every department is the marketing department. Even from a trends perspective, a few years ago, I wouldn't have talked about, Spotify allowing their staff to work from home or Desigual allowing people to vote on a 4-day work week as really a trend, It just wasn't something that would make waves beyond, the internal communications. But now brands like this are driving new perspectives around how we work. And there really is an opportunity, as I say, for every department in a brand to become the marketing department. So there we have it. We have made it through 2 mega trends and 6 sub-trends. Now I see that I have taken my cue from Phil, and I am actually also a moment late, a minute late. So I won't get you to work with the person sitting next to you. Maybe you can discuss these as you have your coffee. We'll have time to hear ideas later. So for now, I think we can all go and have some coffee. I don't think this is not pandemic friendly, so I don't actually want to see any of this behaviour, okay?